Welcome back to Franklin Covey's twice weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. That's me. I've been your host now for nearly 7 years, just shy of 500 episodes, where I've had the enormous privilege twice weekly on Tuesdays and Fridays to join you and interview some of the world's most iconic thought leaders. They have showed up mostly virtually, sometimes in person here, as entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, intrapreneurs, wannapreneurs. Sometimes they are artists and academics and researchers. Other times they're Fortune 50 CEOs or best-selling authors. Sometimes they're celebrities or artists or even actors. And in some occasions, they're not household names. They may be people that survived some unspeakable tragedy, lost a child, survived a commercial airline passenger crash, and lived to tell about it, to teach through it. They've come on to our program to help you become a more effective leader, whether that's a formal or informal leader. Of course, that's the mission of the Franklin Covey Company, is to help you uncover and ignite your genius and your contribution. Franklin Covey, of course, known as the most trusted leadership firm in the world, founded in part by Stephen Covey, of course, who wrote the iconic book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I've been privileged to be associated with Franklin Covey for about 28 years. And this, in fact, is my last time as the host of this podcast. It's time to actually transition this and move on to other investments, both for Franklin Covey and for myself. And so when you host your last interview for a podcast, you pick, which guest do you think could teach our clients, our listeners, our viewers, our subscribers the most about how to be effective? And as you know, Dr. Covey passed about 12 years ago. And so as we went through the iconic contributors to thought leadership, Tim Ferriss came to mind. And Tim was gracious and generous enough to actually not just join us, but to join us live in person in the studio for the last episode of On Leadership with Scott Miller. Franklin Covey is here to stay. They are one of the most influential leadership firms in the world. They've had an immeasurable impact on my career, on my life, my contribution, and I only wish them well in the future with the new podcast, however that ends up repositioning. However, today, for the next 40 or so minutes, I have the privilege of completing this series and interviewing Tim Ferriss, who you know as the author of some of the most important books of our generation, and he's here today live in the studio. Tim, welcome to On Leadership.
Glad to be here.
Great to see you, man. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. I can't do what you just did. I don't know how you did that.
Well, that's that. I got a few reps in that. I'm sure you could do that. So let's talk about your path.
Sure.
Because most people know your name. They've either read 4-Hour Workweek or some of the other books that we have here today. But you started like a lot of thought leaders and authors started. Discipline, a vision, an idea. Rewind a couple of years. It's been about 18 years since you first wrote 4-Hour Workweek. Of course, a lot of fame and attention has come to that. Would you take us back a few decades and talk about your journey? I find that our listeners and viewers always love to know the backstory of how someone got started.
Sure. I'll begin at the very beginning. Born premature, had a lot of health issues, and that's relevant because the NICU was heavily lit, and my mom credits that with creating a lifelong insomniac. Now, the reason that's relevant is that when I was very young, I would stay up until these ungodly hours of the night, 2, 3, 4 a.m. What was on? You could either watch black and white Frankenstein or infomercials. And so from a very young age, I was steeped in these sales pitches and I suppose entrepreneurship on some level. And I wanted to, from a very young age, figure out how it worked. So even, I would say around age 10, I started, sorry to all the call centers who had to field these calls, but I would call the 800 numbers and I would try to figure out the prompts and how they were upselling or cross-selling.
And you were how old at this time?
I was probably 10, 11, 12. And partially because money was always a challenge in my family. We didn't grow up with very much. And it seemed like money was the solution to all problems. Now, flash forward, spoiler, it's not the solution to all problems, but that was the orientation I had. And so I knew that from a very relatively early age, I wanted to figure out how to not trade time for money. It took me a while to get there, but never planned on writing that book. That actually came about because I was invited to go back to my alma mater, my college I graduated from, to guest lecture in high-tech entrepreneurship. And I had not really accomplished anything a few years out of graduation, but my professor was bringing in all of these people who take venture capital, who are playing the venture capital game. And I was one of the few students he knew who had been bootstrapping. And at that time, it was a sports nutrition company, fledgling, really trying to figure things out. But I was close in age to the students. And so I went back twice a year and gave this lecture. And the notes from that class ended up creating the backbone of that book. But I never planned on writing a book, didn't want to write a book because my senior thesis almost killed me. And the only reason it came about is because one of the students, I would always ask for feedback forms, and one of the students said, I don't understand why, it was not a serious recommendation, it was just a snarky kind of mean comment. It was like, I don't understand why you're teaching a class to undergraduates and graduates, why don't you just write a book and be done with it? And I mentioned the insomnia, that stuck in my head, so I started waking up at night, like writing down chapter titles and stuff just to go back to sleep, and ultimately I had met, trying to network by volunteering with nonprofits in Silicon Valley, where I was living at the time. I had met Jack Canfield, co-creator of Chicken Soup for the Soul.
We had on the program.
And I reached out to him and I gave him the bare bones thoughts on the book. And I was like, what do you think? Is there anything here? And I was hoping he would say no. And he was like, oh no, I think there's something here. And then introductions started to get made and one thing led to another. And that's how the book came about. Turned down by 27 or 28, maybe 29, somewhere between 27.
Can you pause there? Because this is an important point. How many times we've interviewed some of the most influential authors of our generation, and they have a very similar story.
Yeah.
That they wrote a book, and then they pitched it to publishers or to agents, whoever. You had 28 rejections.
Well, somewhere between 27 and 29, yeah.
And then what happened?
And then my pitch
30.
got better along the way. And Steve Ross, who at the time was within Random House, he was willing to take a gamble because he was able to get it for a song, pay next to nothing in like 27 installments. I'm exaggerating, but like it was, I think it was $75K advance paid out over a year and a half or 2 years.
Yeah.
And that was it. He was willing to take a gamble. Prior to that, Steve Hanselman was willing to take a risk on me as an agent, but I had good timing because he was a really good editor who had just become an agent. And that was kind of the perfect alchemical combination.
What you needed
for me.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, because I didn't want someone just to sell. I wanted someone who could give good feedback on the book. And that was Steve. And they did an initial print run of 10,000 copies, which is nothing. Like you don't even get national distribution with that. And it hit the New York Times the first week out on the extended list, because even if I sold every copy, it was not enough to make it into the top 10. And then later got up to number 1 on the business list, stayed on the New York Times for 4.5 years, I want to say, 4.5 years or 5 years, something like that. And then
Here we are.
everything else unfolded.
You tapped into what nerve with the 4-hour work week?
Well, with any of these books, particularly I would say the first 3, but also this one and that one to some extent, I only write a book if I can't find a book that I want. That's it. Now, there's so many amazing books, and there are hundreds of thousands of books published every year. Writing books is really hard. It's hard for me, at least, and it's fundamentally not a great way to make money. So for me, that was a combination. That was effectively the book I needed at the time that I had my company to solve the problems that were most painful and to streamline things. Now, there is some timing and luck involved because virtual assistants and other technologies were just coming online. They had not become mainstream, and I helped to popularize those. So it was a combination of entrepreneurship, lifestyle design over kind of the slave, save, retire over 40, 50 years, and then a few technological innovations that I was able to weave into that, including things like virtual assistants. Now, if that were to be revised, we would include a lot of stuff related to AI, for instance. But at the time, that type of book did not exist. I had tried to find that for myself, and the options were either like, here's a guide to minimalism and giving up everything related to capitalism, exit the rat race, but by the way, you're going to be recycling your napkins, or you're living sort of in a very, very minimalist way, or like Jack Welch, here's how to run a Fortune 500 company, and there was not a whole lot in between. So I think that is, to the best of my ability to guess, the chord that was struck. What's crazy about that is that the tools and so on in that book have been outdated basically since day one, right? So I wrote it in 2007. You're holding the 2009 revised edition. The exact tools are obviously going to change all the time. They're outdated. Like almost everything in that book is outdated in the tools, but the philosophical resets, the principles are enduring. So even in 2017, that was the most highlighted nonfiction book on Amazon, depending on how you categorize things, outside of the Bible and maybe one of the Hunger Games books. Those were the top, and Hunger Games was fiction. So that was the most highlighted book on Amazon in nonfiction in 2017. So that's
The 4-Hour Workweek.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think it's probably a lot of the philosophical reframes that have stood the test of time. It's definitely not the tech recommendations.
Let's dive into a couple of the concepts, because I want to broader ski across a lot of areas. The architecture, if you will, for 4-Hour Workweek is an acronym called DEAL. Definition, elimination, automation, and liberation. Let's talk about definition.
Sure.
Because that's kind of where we need to start, right, is to define, riff on that for a few minutes. What do you want 18 years later, what do you want all of our listeners, our leaders, our entrepreneurs, people to know about how important it is to align themselves with definition? Defining what?
Sure. So definition is everything, and that framework applies to almost everything that I do. Also, I mean, that applies to the angel investing I've done, which is by far and away sort of the most lucrative side of my life. It applies to physical performance and the 4-Hour Body, which came after it. So that framework I apply consistently all over the place. Definition is important because if you have it clearly focused on a target, you cannot hit said target. And what I mean by that is if you are doing A, B, or C, pursuing whatever you might be pursuing in the name of success, in the name of happiness, guess what? These terms are very differently defined by different people, if they're defined at all. And it's very hard to chart a path, reverse engineering from where you want to be to where you are, and then following that, if you haven't defined things very, very clearly. So in the context of this book, definition means really looking at your lifestyle. So I mentioned lifestyle design, which is effectively saying what type of life do you want to have and how can you build a career or a business that serves that outcome, right? As opposed to I'm going to build something or chase something and my life will be whatever's left over as a side effect. Sometimes that works, but often it doesn't work. So when you're defining that, in the case of this, you would do an exercise called dreamlining. People can find it online for free. And you would be looking at a few things, what you want to have, what you want to do, what you want to be, so forth and so on. You would cost all of that out, and then you would figure out what your target monthly income is. And from that, now you have numbers to work with. Then you can begin to look at different career paths or company ideas that can facilitate that life that you think you want to have. And I say think you want to have because the through line through this book or any of my books is experimentation. Like you have to test your assumptions, because if you think, well, I'm going to work for 30 years and then retire and sail around the Caribbean, it's like, well, have you ever spent 2 weeks on a sailboat? Maybe you should try that before you bank on that as the redemption for the next 30 years of work. So I would say that definition is really the most critical piece, which is why in the acronym, when I was looking at different variations, it always was the first step.
Tim, like it or not, you probably are credited with the genesis behind mobility with work, right? People working for different locations. And of course, hybrid work has been a massive topic, not just since the pandemic, but even now, the whole back to work initiative. You see a lot of tension happening between big CEOs and big workforces and demanding them come back, and even in the federal workforce as well. Different story behind that. Where do you think that puck is going? If you had to speak right now to every founder, leader, CEO, say, this is the future of work when it comes to the physicality, where do you think that's going? Opine on that.
I actually think that most companies function best with in-person presence in offices. There are some exceptions to that, which did very well during the pandemic, coincidentally. So, for instance, Shopify out of Ottawa, which is an e-commerce platform, largest in the world, I think. I was the first advisor to that company when they had 8 or 10 employees. And they were very prepared technologically and culturally for work from home. So they were able to adapt very quickly. There are some companies like Automatic, M-A-T-T-I-C, which runs WordPress.com and other things. They are a remote work first company. So they're distributed from the get-go. That is built into the DNA of their company. But really, to answer your question directly, I would say most people have not individually, if they work within a company, thought about structure and systems and rules and constraints for themselves. They might think about it on a department level. They might think about it on a company-wide level. But you take those same people, you stick them at home for COVID, let's just say, and they haven't thought through those things from first principles for themselves. They're going to get 10% of what they got done. I think that is pretty definitively the case. The 4-hour work week is sort of built from the individual up. So there are people who apply the principles to companies, but it's very much intended to allow the individual contributor or solopreneur to create those systems, the scaffolding and all of that very deliberately so that they can get as much, if not more, done in various locations. They might choose, because there are things you can do with that, right? You could earn in pounds, and depends on the currency, right? But let's just say you're earning in pounds, your lifestyle is in pesos, and then you're paying people in rupees. Well, you can do some very interesting things with geo arbitrage in that case. But as far as where things are going, I think there will be a pendulum swing back to in-office. We're seeing that with Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan and other places. And I think that many of these leaders are right. I think there is a certain built-in accountability for in-person work. There's also a lot of waste, but it is easier, I think, for large workforces that don't have individual systems of productivity and efficiency to get more done in an office. However, that all having been said, I mean, everything is global. If you look at what I do, my audio editors, my video editors, my copy editors, my alpha readers, they're all over the world. And I don't want to end up focusing on this too much, but AI is going to replace call centers. It's going to replace a lot of legal services. It already is. So I think that a lot of what will make people effective, in addition to the types of systems, not limited to the 4-hour work week, but say different species of productivity that allow an individual to create all of those systems for themselves, will be supplemented by prompt mastery. Like, how good are you at spell casting without AI is going to allow one person. There will be, I think, 1 to 5 person billion-dollar companies within the next 3 years, without a question.
Let's talk about AI.
Sure.
I recently had the privilege of interviewing Seth Godin, who's been on several times. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about how a recent thought leader had sort of, not dismissed, but called out that they thought AI was a little overblown.
Yeah.
And Seth said, I don't agree. That's like saying you won't run your business on electricity. That's how significant it's going to be. Yep. I was at Keith Ferrazzi's Future of Work conference a few weeks ago in New York. And sitting next to me was the EVP of Business Development for LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. And that gentleman said, in the not too distant future, robots are going to do the majority of the work. Mm-hmm. AI will do the majority of the thinking, and people will be managing relationships and interpersonal stuff. Mm-hmm. What do you prognosticate is the impact of AI in the short term? Maybe the next 3 years, how fundamentally different will companies, institutions, societies look like?
Well,
or is it further out?
Yeah, I can only speak, with AI and the rate of technological development. AI is the first fundamental disruptive technology that doesn't behave to spec or design. What I mean by that is 20 years ago, if you were doing a large software development project, or you could be using Agile in combination with this, that, and the other thing, you succeeded if your software did exactly what you had designed it to do. But these large language models and other implementations of artificial intelligence, other AIs, are behaving in ways that are completely unexpected from the standpoint of the people who went into building them. That is very new. So there are people, and I think Jeff Bezos is among them, who liken AI to the discovery of fire. They view it more as a discovery than an invention. That's probably beyond my pay grade to get into the weeds on, but I am definitely on the front line in two ways. I'm not a technologist from the technical perspective. I don't have engineering degrees. I'm not a computer science expert. However, I and my team are using AI dozens of times every day already. And I think that I might be an edge case in that respect, but that will become the norm. So just like software was eating the world, as Mark Andreessen famously said a handful of years ago, very nice phrase, I think AI is going to eat most software. So travel, medicine, even right now, if you go to a lot of the top medical professionals I know, and you ask them, would you rather have a human read your imagery, like your radiology, or a human? Or let's say they're scanning for any number of things, tumors, whatever it might be. They will choose the robots. They will choose the machines. And it's going to become so ubiquitous that I think it is very hard to overstate. So I think folks are like, it's overblown. Maybe the catastrophic apocalyptic, Netflix series type scenarios where like all humans are turned into paper clips or whatever, maybe those are overblown. But in terms of the disruption and there are a lot of techno optimists who disagree with this, but the job loss and how that's going to affect certain social contracts, like what do you put your kids into school for now? It's unclear.
It's true. My wife and I have 3 young boys that are 10, 13, and 14.
Yeah.
And I kind of asking this question to say, gosh, what should they be learning so that they're highly engaged, highly employed, and contributing 10 years from now?
Yeah.
8 years from now.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling is that there was a great New York Times piece that came out recently about creating products using natural language instead of coding in the way that you would learn, programming the way you would learn in the computer science class. I think that the command of very clear language is going to be a huge advantage. So I think English, as much as it's been English majors and so on, as much as they've been beat up over decades with a focus on technical fluency, a lot of coders are going to go out of business. It's just going to become irrelevant for a lot of what needs to be done. And you and I, even right now, could build things using natural language. But the natural language has to be very well defined. Right? You need to know what you're asking for. And it is the rate of change is so great. Humans are very bad at exponentials, right? Just like we saw with COVID, right? Or any type of pandemic. It's very hard to train your mind to think in terms of exponents. But if let's just take what people are most familiar with, something like ChatGPT, these large language models, they are improving. Each model is like a 10x improvement / increase in parameters. People have not been exposed on a mass scale to any technology with that rate of development.
Makes Moore's law look foolish, huh?
It just makes a lot of things almost inconceivable. Mm-hmm. And we're going to get into the weeds real fast. But when you start looking at the convergence of some of these technologies and quantum computing, then your head just explodes. So the rate of technological change that we will see in the next 10 years is unprecedented in the history of humankind.
That's a big statement.
Oh yeah, I don't think it's controversial.
when you are a prolific communicator like you are,
Yep.
newsletters, podcasts, books, you're going to get stuff wrong. You're going to change your mind.
Sure.
As you look across the breadth of your contribution, what have you learned and look back and say, you know, I was wrong about that. I've learned, I've changed my mind. Here's now what I think. Something of consequence.
Yeah, I would say that, well, for a very long time in my life, I would say I compartmentalized things very well and viewed emotions as a liability, and turned off a lot of those sensitivities, which I had as a young kid. I viewed all of that as sort of an irrationality to be contained. And I no longer feel that way. First and foremost, like, humans are not rational actors, which is why like efficient market theory and stuff is so funny to me. But the act and the experience of being human is inherently very messy. And I think I tried to veto that with this appeal to some idealistic Vulcan-like existence, and that was just foolish. I think that was a fool's errand, and I think that emotional, not necessarily fluency, I don't think I'm there yet, but literacy and being able to use things like nonviolent communication and allowing people to vent if they need to vent, as opposed to trying to tell them how irrational they're being. These soft skills in interpersonal relationships are really the crux of it.
This is called marriage.
Yeah, I was listening to a book called, it's actually quite good, called Fierce Intimacy by an amazing couples therapist. I've worked with him before, named Terry Real. And he was citing another therapist who said, there will come a morning when you wake up and you look over at your partner sleeping, your husband or wife, and think, I have made a huge mistake. And he says, that is your first real day of marriage. So that inherent messiness, which I just tried to remove and eliminate, I think that was foolish. I would also say that for a long time, it was just optimization. And I believe that there is a lot that in order to savor, you de-optimize very deliberately, right? So these days, it's like, sure, I used to speed read stuff, and you can train yourself to speed read very easily. It's not voodoo. They're very easy mechanical drills you can do. And you can get to the point where you can read 5-10 pages a minute, no problem. But do you want to do that with poetry? Maybe not, right? If there's a fiction book that you savor and you read a little bit before bed every night, is that how you want to approach it? Probably not.
So you've learned to maybe slow down a little bit, not have a utilitarian lens to which you approach things.
I think that's one way to put it. I think another is, and this comes back to the broader topic of leadership on some level, which is, what you do matters a lot more than how you do it in some cases, which is to say, like, if you choose the right targets, if you choose things in the case of business that are very, very high leverage, you can execute as a B player and still get incredible results. You can procrastinate, you can make mistakes, you can wake up on the wrong side of the bed, waste a day or two, or maybe a week or two, and still get a lot done if you actually are better at picking high leverage targets. Conversely, if you get really good at doing something, you are the epitome, you're the paragon of efficiency, but you chose the wrong target, doesn't matter. You execute as an A+ player and you're on it every minute of every day. If you're pointing in the wrong direction, if you chose something that's low leverage, doesn't matter. And I suppose realizing that again and again and again with so many different fields, interviewing 800 people across the world in different disciplines, this lesson comes back again and again, which is, if you feel really rushed, your priorities are off or your psychological orientation is off. And it's just not necessary. Plus, like, what game are we trying to win? There is no game to win. It's like there is no clear finish line after which anyone who's building businesses, acquiring money, acquiring power, acquiring relationships, whatever it might be, has quote unquote won. They will never feel that way. And when you have that realization, or it's forced upon you, when you have like a breakdown, which was part of this book too, then I think you feel better about injecting slowness into your life more readily, because you realize that it's to your benefit and rarely to, if you're smart about it, rarely to the detriment of what you're trying to do.
One of the assets of success like yours is access to thought leaders and innovators and creators and designers. What have you learned that you wish other people knew? Has someone taught you something that maybe is perhaps profound or real simple that you wish more people had access and understood like you've come to understand it?
About relationships?
You name it.
But this question is around kind of network and relationships.
No, from your network, from people you've had access to, what have you learned that's kind of golden that you wish it was Pandora's box in a good way and more could see this the way you've learned to see it?
Well, let me talk about the relationships, because I think
that's what matters.
That is the unlock. And I think there's some misconceptions about networking. Number one, it's not the size that matters. It really isn't. Having 10,000 loose ties is not interesting to me. I would say that one thing people should realize is that if you know A players, people who are some of the best at what they do in any field, those A players across disciplines tend to know one another. So that's great news. What that means is you don't need to know everyone. Through my closest, let's just say 10 friends who I also do some degree of business with, I can reach almost anyone because they're very good at whatever it happens to be that they do. And that's number one. So you don't have to play it's not a game of tonnage. You don't have to play the volume game when it comes to relationships. And what that allows you to do also is to play the long game, slow down. And there are a few tips I'll give for people. First, I mentioned Jack Canfield, and I met him because I came out of college. I knew nobody. I was driving around in my mom's hand-me-down minivan, which was just a piece of garbage. It was so beat up. And the way I built my network was volunteering for nonprofits related to startups, like Silicon Valley Association of Startup Entrepreneurs, TIE, the Indus Entrepreneur. Last I checked, I am not Indian. Doesn't matter. They needed volunteers. And I would go to these events. They had amazing panelists, right? Vinod Khosla types, Jack Canfield types, like top tier. And I would volunteer. And what you notice very quickly if you volunteer at these types of events is that people who volunteer tend to do the least amount necessary. If you go above and beyond, you are promoted, which means, yes, you're not getting paid, but you're given more responsibility. So within a few months of just doing extra stuff, filling up people's water, if I was done doing the ticketing, whatever.
Your exposure increases.
They were like, hey, do you want to run one of our main events? And I was like, can I invite the speakers? They're like, sure, you can invite the speakers. And I was like, great, I'm going to invite people I want to learn from. One of them was Jack Canfield. And that's how I slowly started to build those relationships. And when I say play the long game, I would say, I'll give another tip. And I do have a talk on this for people who want something longer, which has the very clickbaity title of How to Build a World-Class Network in Record Time. I gave it at South by Southwest because at a conference like South by Southwest, people tend to run around trying to collect 1 million. At the time, business cards. Now it's just contact information. For instance, you go to an event, there are 4 or 5 panelists. Everyone's going to want to talk to the panelists. People are going to rush the stage afterwards. Who's going to be neglected and who knows all of those panelists? The moderator. Go up and talk to the moderator. And the way you do that is very simple. You sincerely compliment them on something you liked about the panel, and you say, I imagine you're super busy. Don't want to take up too much of your time, but I don't really know the event. This is an industry that's new to me, which was true for me. And this is why I'm here. Can you think of anyone I might get along with? Is there anyone here you think I might enjoy having a conversation with? Almost always, like, oh yeah, you should talk to Toby so-and-so. You should talk to, Susan so-and-so. And then you talk to that person. And guess what? You ask them the same question. And then you come out with, say, 5 very good contacts. And I still remember the first time I went to South by Southwest, 2007, that helped launch this book. there are probably a dozen people I met that way at that conference I am still friends with. So that's the long game. That's what I would recommend.
Let's talk about plant-based medicines and psychedelics. It seems like that is not a fad. It seems like it's more than a wave, that it is a increasingly interesting and responsible and participated in, I wouldn't call it a pastime, I would call it a path.
Yeah.
Whether it's psychedelics or where is that going? You're on the cutting edge, I think, in terms of access and information. Yeah. What would you like most people who don't really even know much about it to better understand? It's becoming much more legitimized and mainstream.
Yeah, so as context, I have a foundation called the Saisei Foundation. Saisei means rebirth in Japanese. I spent a lot of time in Japan, and it focuses on mental health therapeutics for conditions that are considered difficult or close to impossible to treat. So treatment-resistant depression, chronic anxiety, anorexia nervosa and other eating disorders, borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, etc. And I don't focus exclusively on psychedelics, but they are, I think, a category of tool that is very, very potent. And so I've funded a lot of the science in that field since 2015 and put double digits of my total net worth into that. What I think would be helpful as a primer for folks, I would say, just as one example. So MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. I should note that Utah is actually a leader in pushing a lot of this forward. Intermountain Hospital System is, I think, the first in the nation to look both at MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy and to offer both. So Utah is actually at the forefront, which a lot of people would not expect, perhaps. Oddly enough, also Texas, first state to provide state funding for research into psychedelics because of the veteran applications for post-traumatic stress disorder. But if you take something like complex PTSD, which means post-traumatic stress disorder, that could be from any number of experiences at war for a veteran. It could be from sexual abuse. It could be from any number of things. Complex means, in simple terms, that it's failed multiple interventions. Different types of treatments have been tried, they have failed. If you look at, as I'll give one example, the magnitude of effect of some of these compounds when they're done in responsible clinical settings with psychotherapy, so MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, in the phase 2 and phase 3 trials that were done, which I helped to support, the patients being treated, I want to say, and these numbers are not going to be exactly right, but they're going to be close, had an average length of diagnosis of something like 16.8 years. So they'd had complex PTSD, unsuccessfully treated for that long. And they participated in, I want to say, 2 or 3 MDMA-assisted psychotherapy sessions. Those last on the order of 4 to 6 hours, typically 2 clinicians, 2 therapists who talk to the patient if the patient wants to talk. Oddly enough, not always necessary, but if the patient wants to interact, there are different tools like internal family systems that seem to work well with this. After these treatments, and there's a lot of preparation and there's also integration and lots of talking afterwards, but the crux of it is 2 or 3 sessions of 4 to 6 hours. I want to say that on the CAPS-5 scale, if I'm getting that right, which is an assessment, the number of people who went from extreme symptoms, meaning they're effectively shut-ins, they can't hold a job, et cetera, maybe they're at home with the curtains down, to asymptomatic, they no longer qualify for PTSD diagnosis, was something along the lines of like 50%. This is after those treatments. I think it's actually slightly more than that. More compelling is that something along the lines of 6 months later, that number went up and not down. So it went from like 50 to 60 or 55% to 65%. So the durability is also something that psychiatry has never seen. And for that reason, I'm excited about these things. I mean, some of these medicines have, I think, they have fundamentally changed my life. I come from a family with a history of depression, almost killed myself in college, and went from, I would say, 3 to 4 major depressive episodes a year to 1 every 3 years. And those are two different human experiences. Those are two different humans. It's really hard to overstate how significant that is. Now, I would say they're not a panacea. They're contraindicated for some people. If you have a family history of schizophrenia, for instance, you should not touch classical psychedelics. MDMA is a slightly different compound, but in terms of psilocybin, which is found in so-called magic mushrooms, like psilocybe, for instance, wouldn't want to touch those. Things like ayahuasca you need to be very careful with. LSD would certainly also be in that class. But they do have applications, and they are nuclear power. Like, you are using nuclear power, so you have to be cautious. But there are some incredible applications. You look at scientists like Gould Dolan, who's looking at MDMA specifically for reopening critical developmental windows. So for instance, she thinks that there might be applications to people who have a stroke. They lose, say, use of part of their body, or they develop aphasia, they can't speak, to reopen the window through which they can redevelop those things. So
how far out is that likelihood? Or
it's being looked at now. I mean, this now, pharma moves very slowly. So when will it be available to people broadly? It's very hard to say, because academic research moves slowly. But what I would say is, I do agree with Stanislav Grof, who's a very famous psychotherapist, who is also very involved pre-prohibition, before all these drugs were put into the Controlled Substance Act and Schedule 1, things like that. He said that, effectively, what the telescope was for astronomy and what the microscope was for biology, psychedelics will be for the mind. And I agree with that. But in addition to all of that, let's just say with people who might have family history of BPD, borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, things like that, these drugs are contraindicated. So then I would be looking at things, and I am funding things like direct brain stimulation or accelerated TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. You see some tremendous transformations also through some of those other technologies, which are still, they're readily available. They're just not widely distributed.
I'm mindful of our time. I have a couple more questions.
Yeah, fire away.
What are you studying right now, not out of pleasure, but perhaps out of professional necessity, meaning you think the world is headed here and you want to be out in front, in the hopes that people would say, well, gosh, if you're studying it, I should too?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be maybe a broken record response, but I think everybody should be playing with AI tools, particularly playing around with deep research, whether that's through OpenAI and ChatGPT, or you could use Gemini's pretty good as well. I use Perplexity a lot in place of Google for more current information, but rather than checking 20 websites and reading a bunch of articles, you can have AI do it for you in 30 seconds. It is really head spinning how quickly these things are improving. So I would say, I don't feel necessarily a professional need to do that, but I would like to have my sleeves rolled up, and I would like to have some familiarity with what these models are doing. It seems like it will be relevant to almost everything that we do. So that's my answer there. I would say otherwise, as you know, people can't see this, but my elbow's wrapped up because I had platelet-rich plasma at the University of Utah injected into my elbow joint, and then also into the extensor tendons here for a host of reasons due to acute and chronic injuries. I'm very interested in connective tissue health. How do you strengthen tendons and ligaments? A lot of people exercise, they focus on something that addresses the musculature, something that might address the lungs. They think of quote unquote aerobic exercise. I put that in quotes for a couple of reasons, but Dr. Keith Barr, B-A-A-R, I encourage people to check his work out. I just did an interview with him. But I think we are about as old, putting aside cognition, we could talk about that, but we're about as old as our joints feel. And so I'm paying a lot more attention to—
My mother would agree.
Yeah, joints and connective tissue.
What book have you read that's had the biggest impact on you?
I would say the Moral Letters to Lucilius by Seneca the Younger. Easier to remember.
You're a Stoic
collection of that would be Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Penguin Classics. That's easy. That I've read many, many times. There's another book called Awareness by Anthony DeMello, and I think the subtitle is the Promise and Perils of Reality. Awareness is a very good. It's mostly transcribed and cleaned up lectures of Anthony DeMello, who was a Jesuit priest and a psychotherapist. And this book is very helpful for allowing the reader to examine the stories that they permit to run their lives unexamined. And that, I think, is a sort of a fundamental aspect of everyone's reality. Our awareness, if focused upon, tends to address so many things that flow from it. So rather than trying to fix 17 different problems, a lot of them can be remediated just by looking at the awareness. So I would say, and cultivating that. So Awareness by Anthony DeMello, it's very easy to read. It's very short. Those would be two.
Sounds like a trite question. Best advice you ever received that you came later to implement? Maybe you didn't take it up right away. And
I would say it was the answer from Dr. B.J. Miller, who is a triple amputee. He was electrocuted himself accidentally in college, but he is a hospice care physician, so he's helped thousands of people to die. He's been there when they've transitioned. And I asked him what he would put on a billboard for everyone to see, metaphorically, and he said, "Don't believe everything that you think." And it's easy to gloss over that or maybe chuckle about it, but when you actually reflect on it, and it ties into the awareness and Anthony DeMello, it took me a while to appreciate just how life-changing that is if you pay attention to it regularly. Like, don't believe everything that you think. The stories, the beliefs, meaning the thoughts you take to be true, most of them can't hold any water.
Yeah, Dr. Amen has been on our program many times. He'll tell you how frequently your brain lies to you, and how careful you have to be to guard yourself. Okay, let's talk about books. Lastly, you've got one in the hopper. What would you like to tell all of our listeners and viewers around what to expect next from you as an author?
Yeah, it's my first book in 6 or 7 years. First started writing it probably 6 years ago. Current code name for the book is The No Book, and it's a book on
N-O, The No Book.
N-O, and it is a book on how to focus, find meaning and peace in a world of noise. That's the book, and
that book will sell.
I think I dusted it off and actually started finishing it because the problems have gotten so much worse in the last few years, and they're going to get.
Is that because everybody's being assaulted with choice? Is because our attention spans are diminishing? It's because
all of the above. And I mean, pretty much any digital tool is a vehicle through which companies and people buy or steal your attention. And if you don't have attention, you don't have anything.
Yeah.
Even if you have a lot of time in your calendar, if you don't have attention, that time is worthless. So this book it's actually very similar to the 4-Hour Workweek in some ways, because there are like the philosophical resets, which are very important. Without that, the templates and the word-for-word scripts and stuff don't really matter. But there's a lot in it. And I'm also, I asked one of my friends let me rewind. So I have a friend, his name is Neil Strauss. So he's a 10-time New York Times bestselling author. He also writes books for other people. He wrote, along with Rick Rubin, The Creative Act, which was a huge bestseller. Yeah. And Neil is terrible at saying no, or historically he has been. And we've been friends for a long time. And so he was harassing me repeatedly, asking me when this No Book was going to be finished. And I was like, it's not going to be finished. I don't want to finish it. It's like, it's a big lift. And I already have whatever it is, a few hundred pages, but it's like, it's always like when your book is 90% done, like congratulations, you only have 50% left. Like to really polish the end is very, very time consuming. And eventually he was getting so annoying that I was like, Neil, if you want this book to be done so badly, help me finish writing it. And then he came back a few days later. He's like, if you're serious, like we can have a serious conversation. And so that's what we ended up doing. And the reason that's fun is that I think, quite good at saying no, which by the way, The no book is really a book about yes. It's how do you pick the really big yeses that allow you to defend against the million things you should say no to. So it's actually the most life-affirming book I think I've ever written. But
this will become a competitive advantage for people, their ability to say
huge
no,
competitive advantage.
because they have identified like the bigger burning yes, if you will.
I mean, if you can single task on one high leverage thing for 3 hours a day, you're going to beat 99% of the people out there. And that's going to continue it's going to get more and more difficult to do without the right system. So
do you teach a system in the book?
Oh yeah. It's comprehensive. And what's fun about it is that Neil is basically the student going through it with me. So we have these like marital spats about stuff. We have these text exchanges, lots of real messy examples, like real life examples. They are messy, and how he ultimately resolves them. So it's been a great journey. I expect that'll come out probably in its finished form for the holidays. Right now, I am releasing it chapter by chapter to my newsletter subscribers, so they get to read it first if they want to read it. What
percentage of the book will they consume over the course of that?
I'm not sure.
A third or something maybe? Or?
Yeah, I mean, if people want to check it out, 5 Bullet Fridays is the name. tim.blog/Friday. They can find the newsletter. It's free. I'm not sure. Right now, given how I want to get it out by the holidays, and I'm currently putting out 1 step per week, and we have at least 30 steps. If I drip it out 1 per week, I'm not going to make my deadline. So I will probably accelerate that. I'm not sure. I mean, I would think at least a third.
What have you done well that's replicable by anybody and everybody? Was it your discipline? Was it your newsletter? Was it you created a database a decade and a half ago? Was it you said no to things? Was there something you've done that's disproportionately consequential that anybody watching today, right now, could do if they wanted it bad enough?
Yeah, definition as described in the 4-Hour Work Week. That's it. Like the tools,
the D and deal.
The tools, the strategy. I think discipline is overrated. Like you need systems. It's like Archilochus, famous poet.
Of course. Archilochus.
Yeah, of course, Archilochus. We do not rise to the level of our hopes. We fall to the level of our training. Discipline's overrated. You need systems and processes that you can follow. So definition for sure. And I'm like, people don't have to buy the book. I'm sure you can find a PDF or someone who scraped the audiobook and threw it online for free on YouTube. But the definition piece is really, I feel like I really take my time to pick targets that I have cross-examined that have very high likelihood of being super high leverage. And part of being high leverage is picking something that makes everything else easier or irrelevant. So you have 10 different projects you might choose from, 5 different projects. Pick the one that makes the other ones easier or irrelevant. That is high leverage. So I would say it's the definition, because there are a million books on strategy, a million books on how to do stuff. The how, it is important, but it is incredibly secondary to making sure that you're pointing it with laser-like focus at the right high leverage target. And you can train yourself to do that.
Tim Ferriss, left hand shake to honor your recovery of your right hand.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in today. So generous and magnanimous of you to finish off the podcast series live and in person. Looking forward to the new book coming out in the fall. Thanks for feeding our listeners and viewers today.
Thanks, my pleasure.
And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership, but with a new FranklinCovey host. Thanks for joining us.